that children are learning at a rate that's optimal for them. And of course that requires resourcing, and that's always difficult. We've, in our research, used teaching assistants very effectively indeed. Sometimes teaching assistants get a bad press, but if you train teaching assistants properly and you support them in delivery, they can actually do a very good job for helping children with dyslexia, language difficulties and so on. So I mean, I think it's about how you organise the classroom and how the school is organised to the benefit of children with special needs like dyslexia.
Is it the case then that, you know, if we look at dyslexia and different severities of dyslexia, is that a naturally occurring thing where dyslexia can be more severe, or is there a factor of how well supported has that child been, and thus the severity of the dyslexia sort of results from that?
Yes. Well, I think dyslexia does vary from mild to severe. That's part of it being a dimension or a continuum. But I think you also have to think about impact on everyday functioning. So, yeah, I do think some children, particularly children where they have dyslexia that's sort of been in the family for, you know, generations, have a severe form of dyslexia. The impact of that on that child can depend on a host of factors. One, of course, being parental support, one being school support, one also sometimes being the temperament of the child, because you can actually, you know, for some children, they can deal with the fact that they are confronting failure every day, and they're resilient, and perhaps they have something else they're good at, like sport or music or singing. And then you have other children for whom the sense of failure builds up and affects their self-esteem, and that has an impact then on their progress. In other words, you've got to think about two dimensions here: the severity of the problem and also some of the other variables that might actually affect everyday functioning. So you can have a mild dyslexic, but with a very high impact.
It sounds like it's an incredibly, what teachers need to remember is that a label of dyslexia is not going to be the route to a solution to supporting that child, and it has to be quite an individualised approach to support. That I guess gives some credence to those teachers who will say, do you know what, let's pretend dyslexia doesn't exist and just treat the child that's in front of us. But obviously you still use the term dyslexia, so where do you sort of sit on that debate, I guess?
Well, so I've studied dyslexia for far too long, almost 40 years, I think. But one of the things that I've done in recent years is we've been following a group of, a cohort of children who are at family risk of dyslexia. So they have a parent who is affected. And we compare them with kids from families where there's no history of reading problems. And if you follow those kids from about 3.5, as we do, and then you follow them till around about age 8, and you decide who are dyslexic and who are not, and then you look back and you see, well, what characterised the children who go on to be dyslexic in the early years, what you can see very early on, before reading instruction, is that these children have difficulties with what we call phonological skills, the speech processing aspects of language. They have difficulty with phonological memory, so they have problems in saying new words. They often have some speech difficulties, and these can exist without any language problem. And those problems can be seen very early on, and they translate into problems with learning letters, where you have to learn to associate the sound with the letter. They translate into problems with phonological awareness, where you have to identify the sounds in spoken words, and together those two things are enough to impact decoding. So I believe in dyslexia because it occurs very early on, before people start arguing about whether it's an effect of the school system or laziness or parental lack of parental support in school. You can see it very early on. So I really believe it exists, and I think it's very important that we don't lose that in the complexity of the way in which it's diagnosed, the only valid way of diagnosing it is by looking at behaviour on a reading and spelling measure. And unfortunately, on those measures, children with for other reasons, can actually end up with the same, if you like, signature. And then it's about unpicking what you do for those children on different trajectories. If you take the example of children with English as an additional language, they might be slow at learning to read, but actually they soon pick up, and actually they don't have any decoding problems, unlike children with dyslexia. But at one point in time, of course, they might be exactly the same, but maybe they've only just arrived in the country. So we have to try and exclude other factors, and we might want to have hypotheses about what the cause is, but still what we've got to do is intervene and monitor.
It's interesting you mentioned the phonics screening test as a good way of determining how far a child's progressing on that. Do you think the test itself is necessary? Is it a medium to ensure schools are teaching phonics, therefore spotting those problems? Would they do that without that test? Well, that's why it was introduced.
Yeah. You probably know that I have had some. I have been critical of it in some ways. So first of all, I'm a great believer in non-word reading as a good pure measure of decoding. Concerned that by having that as the target, teachers might start teaching children to read non-words, which as a little exercise might be okay, but as a daily diet, it completely misses the point that the goal of reading is reading for meaning. So that's one of the problems. But more interestingly, we did a study when we were in York, where we looked at teachers' ratings of children's progress through what was the phonics instruction program, which came out of the Rose Report. So this was a phonics sort of checklist, and every half term the teacher just decided at what point on this checklist the child had reached. So whether they could just do their letter sounds, or whether they could do combinations of sounds, or whether they could now do the sort of long vowels like AE and IGH. So you could see progress, and it was kind of benchmarked about where you ought to be during Key Stage 1 at different points in time. So teachers were trained to do that. This was a whole authority, professional development program. And then, of course, the phonics screen came along. So I said, well, let's see whether the phonics screen tells us anything that the teacher judgments could not have told us. And the answer is it can't.
Okay.
Teacher judgments were as good as the phonics screening check. Now, I admit that depends upon being in a local authority where there was very good professional training and where every school was doing what they were supposed to be doing. I also understand that the government was worried about making sure that every school was doing that. So I have sort of, I'm a bit ambivalent about the screening check. The most important thing about the check is when it's done, there must be action for the children who don't do well.
And presumably that means not just more of the same, because obviously that hasn't worked for some reason up to that point. Exactly. Yeah. Is it in terms of that phonological awareness, and you said that tracks back to the inability or the difficulty in pronouncing words or getting the right words out as such. Is that something that is looked at in nursery and preschool enough? I mean, it strikes me that that's a great place to suddenly flag a problem. In your experience, is the training in place at that stage to start that support at that stage?
Well, first of all, it's not just speech. It's really, I think, processing speech. So it might not manifest itself actually as an articulation problem. I don't think there's anything in place very early on that would indicate that. Very early on, what I think is critical is that children's language development is monitored, because although early language delay isn't a particularly significant indicator of later language delay. Many children who've got early language delays do go on to have dyslexic difficulties. And generally, if your child's got a language delay, it's quite good to tell parents and early years providers what they might do to facilitate oral language development. So, but at the moment, that's not really being done, and I think that's a shame. That you can think that monitoring language and then emergent literacy probably a bit later on is a good thing to do, and it could be that health professionals could usefully do that during the preschool years. Because these difficulties for dyslexic kids are seen very, very early. I would say, however, that there's also a group for whom the problems occur later. And these are often kids who have compensated very well because maybe they've had a lot of a good sort of home literacy environment. Maybe they're relying a bit on their good vocabulary to read, and their problems often only emerge a bit later when the amount they have to read increases.
That's interesting because you get quite a lot of the cynicism around dyslexia in secondary schools where they're saying, well, actually, these haven't been taught properly at primary, and the notion is that if the dyslexia hadn't been spotted, then well, there must be something else going on. But if you're saying actually children could be relatively good at compensating is the word you use. They can be quite good at compensating up to that stage, then get to more challenging texts, probably a more demanding environment that it can manifest at that stage.
Well, where you've got to do a lot of reading for homework, it's going to take you twice as long. It's going to become a problem which might not have been a problem before in primary school. But I think the more major problem for secondary schools is actually the in a way the casualties who are leaving primary school reading at a 6 or 7 year level, and there's too many of them. So I also think it's really important to work on these problems as soon as they arise, not least because of the impact on self-esteem and academic self-concept. And when you start to try to intervene in secondary school, you get motivational problems compounded by timetabling difficulties, and it's just really, really hard to help if you leave it that late.
I think that notion of academic self-confidence is another interesting one in the sense that if you're having difficulty accessing language, that can lead to assumptions about your ability or your potential attainment, when actually, from what you said, I mean, you may have been handicapped slightly by your access to language, but that doesn't necessarily say anything at all about your potential abilities.
No, that's right. Well, I mean, self-concept is a complex, as I'm sure you know, complex construct, and there are different aspects of it. And you could actually have a positive self-concept about yourself in maths, but a very bad one about yourself in English. What we don't want is generalised low self-esteem that's going to affect everything and is going to affect motivation. So I think always, whenever I used to see kids for dyslexia assessment or assessment of their learning needs, I think it was always very important not just to say what you need to do to move them, to remediate the problem, but also what should you be doing to ensure that you keep in sight their strengths, their interests, and because those doing well in those other areas can support their difficulties in the reading domain.
Is it so when you now have adults who are still severely affected by dyslexia, are they the most severe cases, do you think, or are they children who have possibly been let down by the education system?
I think a bit of both. But I do think in general, as a society, we need to have a much better way of, different ways of going on towards careers. So we have more vocational training and apprenticeships. I mean, this is becoming a bit of a broken record. But I think with a child with dyslexia, if that child had really high quality evidence-based support for about 2 years, and they're not really really progressing and they're struggling, I think we really have to start thinking about compensation in a big way. That is, we have to start bringing in IT. There's no reason why children can't use voice-to-text software, planning organisers, dictaphones, but ultimately also choice of GCSE subjects, choice of educational options after school. At the moment, it is a bit like a sausage machine that caters for the sort of average to above average child who is going to be able to cope, and with literacy being really important. We need to think of other very successful career trajectories that are not dependent upon literacy. Yeah, we just need to have a broader view of what success in school is, because well-being is ultimately what we've got to work towards, and for most people, unfortunately, in our society, that means being literate. So how do we foster, well-being in kids who find literacy problematic? Of course, many people with dyslexia call themselves entrepreneurs. They say being free from literacy enables them to do these rather different things.
And what are you working on at the moment? What's your sort of aim in your research currently?
Well, I'm still doing some basic research following up this cohort of children with a family history of dyslexia, looking at their outcomes and what predicts their outcomes. But also our group is moving much more to developing educational interventions. So this is work with Charles Hume, and we've spent many years looking at reading interventions, and now our main agenda is looking at interventions to improve oral language. We've we're just about to embark. We are embarking currently on the third trial. This is a randomized control trial of our Nuffield Early Language Intervention, which is an intervention aimed at children entering reception class who've got poor oral language. We know children who've got poor oral language tend not to respond very well to literacy instruction. The oral language program is delivered by teaching assistants that we train, and it involves three components: training in vocabulary, training in narrative skills, and training in listening comprehension. And in two previous trials, a research trial and a trial run by independent evaluators funded by EF, we've demonstrated efficacy of the approach, and we're now just rolling it out in 200 schools, and we're evaluating its impact. Hopefully, after that, we can actually say this is really an effective program for oral language skills. Now, at the end of the oral language program, we do introduce some work on letter sounds and phoneme awareness, because obviously you need to make a bridge into literacy, and these are some of the aspects of literacy which you might say are language related, particularly phonological awareness. And I suppose our vision is that we can actually work with kids from preschool right through the primary curriculum with slightly different interventions, because some of these children who come to school who are ill prepared, either because they've got developmental language disorder or dyslexia, initially need help with language, then learning to read, but then with reading comprehension and with writing. And what we need are a suite of interventions that either you can say, these children need a reading comprehension intervention, we'll give that in year 4, or you can say, for one of your dyslexic children, okay, now their reading comprehension isn't very good because they've sort of missed out in the classroom, we can give it to them as well. So you'd have some people going through all of your interventions, because dyslexia is severe and it has a wide impact, but you'd also have these interventions available for kids with very specific needs at very specific points in time.
So when does that report? That's a couple of years, did you say?
The trial that we're doing now, the trials that we've done so far are already published. The trial we're doing now, we will finish in July 2018.
It'd be good to feature the results of that in TES, I hope, and see
that would be good. Yeah. Hopefully it will work. It's worked every time before.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today. I think it's a fascinating topic, and hopefully, it would have been useful for the teachers listening out there.
Okay, it is. I would just want to say it is a complex topic, and I think what the teacher's role is to monitor the reading and spelling as it develops, have input there to help, and also to monitor the child's kind of self-concept and check that they're supporting that as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
不，我没钱。
你多少钱买的呀
400.8。我
没跟你说，那天我是397.47买的，我寻思盯着它都降了，因为我盯它好几天了，它一直在399到400零点的撞，我都一直没买。
那你咋没跟我说呢？
那你买这头也没问我呀，我以为你不玩了呢。
我也是
好几天了。
你下次买高峰。
我那天买，我没跟你说我是397.47买的。
你没跟我说，我昨天晚上问你，你才跟我说的。
然后我买完以后，它马上都上涨了，我400几卖的，我那早晨买的那都那天涨不大，结果后来我都发现它这两天一直在399到400零点都我都不买，今天我都盯着它，刚才它降到397.2了，我呱呱买了25个，行了，好嘞，因为你不能买太高了，它里边还得加交易费。
我知道。
好嘞，不要了吧。
拜拜。